Thank you. Kia ora koutou, ko Angela Curl, tokoinga. I'm at the University of Otago Christchurch campus, so sorry I'm not there with you in the Department of Public Health. And I'm going to be talking about some work done predominantly by Gethin over the past year, which was funded through a seed grant from the Otago Energy Research Council for the fieldwork that he did. Centre, sorry, not council. Double energy vulnerability, I'll just get straight into it, refers to the likelihood of experiencing negative impacts on wellbeing at the intersection of domestic energy poverty and transport energy poverty, or the inability to attain the socially and materially needed levels of energy services and transport services such as everyday mobility and access to amenities. So the reason we wanted to do this work is because there's been increasing international attention paid to the concept of double energy vulnerability. But to date, largely both internationally and New Zealand, energy vulnerability or energy hardship work has focused on domestic energy services, but not included transport within that consideration of energy needs, despite transport accounting for large and growing proportions of our energy consumption. And we know that households can make trade-offs between domestic energy expenditure and transport energy expenditure, as well as other things such as food, and that policy measures that will be used to address climate transitions will likely affect both domestic energy and transport energy. And the electrification of transport then makes it more obviously become part of our household energy use and household energy budgets. And both domestic energy poverty and transport energy poverty have well-established negative impacts on well-being. So paying attention to them and the impact of any policy on energy vulnerability is important. So energy hardship, and there's varying definitions of this going back to the early 90s from Boardman, but it led to that inability to obtain adequate energy services or households not being able to afford enough energy to adequately heat the home and income. And there's a wealth of research into some of the negative impacts on both physical and mental health as a result of being unable to obtain enough energy to heat the home, for example. Transport poverty, on the other hand, has received less attention in terms of the health impacts, although there is some emerging work, including this work from Public Health Scotland last year. And transport poverty impacts health through limiting the things that people are able to get to, reducing access to healthcare, and increasing exposure to harms. So if people who are in transport poverty are more likely to be exposed to the negative outcomes like pollution or injury, and also the burden of financial distress that is associated with transport costs. People are probably familiar with the idea of eat or heat, but bringing transport into that kind of trade-offs that people are making as well. And while transport poverty is most obviously and often referred to as a rural issue, there is also a lot of evidence around this being an issue in urban areas as well. But as I already said, it's largely been excluded in discussions of domestic energy poverty and hardship. So we just wanted to do this kind of scoping early work on the concept of DV in New Zealand. So energy hardship is officially defined by MB, and there's estimates of the number of people that are experiencing energy poverty, but there's no official recognition, definition, or measure of transport poverty, although some of the elements of transport poverty were included in the Transport Outcomes Framework and Monitoring. And there was some work done around 10 years ago looking at when petrol expenditure was included in estimates of expenditure, then fuel poverty would increase from around 17% of the population to 19%. And there is some New Zealand work showing evidence of those trade-offs, including preserving transport expenditure over food costs. So what we did in this research was a scoping review focused on policy-related literature around double energy vulnerability, which looked at the international literature on DEV, and then because there was none in New Zealand, we looked separately at the literature on energy hardship and transport poverty. And then we undertook workshops. We did 3 workshops, one in Wellington, one in Christchurch, and one online, with 40 participants in total, with people in policy-related roles and a whole range of sectors, where we did some presentations on from the literature review, the existing work in this space, and then did breakout focus groups, so 6 different focus groups across the 3 workshops, and some systems mapping sessions, which I'm not going to talk about today. So we had people from a whole range of organisations, Wellington, but city councils, regional councils, Ministry for Environment, Climate Change Commission, Waka Kotahi, New Zealand Transport Agency, and some representatives from disability organisations who were particularly interested in talking to us about this topic, and not the Ministry of Transport, who did not want to talk about it, or who were unable to because of resourcing. So some of the discussions, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the early analysis that we're still working on from this project. Talked about whether the concept of double energy vulnerability was useful to people, and participants in the workshops talked about the similarities and differences between energy hardship and transport poverty, but largely saw them as aligned. So yeah, I see transport as an energy consumption. I mean, it is completely. And they saw it as an issue that they were facing day to day in their working lives in practice. So these 2 things come up together. The mix is there. But at the same time, others felt that it was not necessarily particularly useful to just talk about energy and transport without also talking about other aspects of poverty, particularly including food. And so they saw that the underlying drivers of both of these are material deprivation and income poverty. So you can see this, like, how do you decide where to draw the line? Because, well, proposing a line around energy poverty plus transport poverty, why isn't food there? And we did have some much broader and really interesting discussions around some of the structural determinants. And while income can help people overcome those, people on low incomes don't necessarily need to be in energy poverty if we have, or not to the same extent, if we have addressed some of those structural issues around warm homes or good public transport systems. So some really interesting debate and discussion there around the utility of the concept. And people also identified this reluctance to use the term poverty in a policy sense and trying to sort of ignore the existence of it. So why do we struggle so much to, actually have an adult conversation and say we're facing poverty? And people felt that it was something that it was easier to choose to ignore and therefore not pay much attention to in a policy sense. And then in the discussions around policy and what might be useful in a policy sense in this space, there were some really interesting discussions around the cross-sector nature of these issues, and the need to actually think about this in a long-term process and thinking about how our legislative processes do or do not support policy that might address energy vulnerability. So yeah, how do we think about our future generations? How is it that policymakers can adhere to a particular act so that they have to adhere to this coming in and then mandatory policy? And this kind of relates to the next one as well, about how can we have policy more bipartisan that cuts across governments so that we're not seeing flip-flopping back and forth on issues like energy vulnerability between governments. And it seemed there was kind of an agreement that everyone knew what needed to be done, but how do we actually do that? How do we implement those policies? And the fact that the agencies are all siloed from each other and often looking at similar things in slightly different ways, rather than having a more cohesive thing, which I think we know are common problems across all areas, but came up particularly in these discussions.
You're just up to 9 minutes.
Okay, this is my final slide. So just some of the key things that came up in terms of contextual issues that might be specific to Aotearoa in terms of thinking about double energy vulnerability in our workshops. The participants talked about urban design, provision of social housing, our public transport systems, issues of climate variation across the country, and the way in which we distribute energy and the markets. And then they also identified groups that they thought were most likely, or had evidence that were most likely experiencing double energy vulnerability. And they probably don't come as any surprise, hasn't come up in a lot of literature in this space. So that's where we're at the moment. This was, as I said, kind of a scoping project around the topic to think about the relevance, use, and potential areas for further research around double energy vulnerability in New Zealand. Thank you to OERC for funding the workshops. And in terms of next steps, we're writing up that paper at the moment on the policy workshops, as well as some quantitative work from a survey. And new news as of this afternoon, a new announcement of some additional projects in the applied doctorate scheme. I'm really pleased that we have a project looking at transport and energy from an equity and energy transport poverty perspective. So if anyone knows of anyone that would be interested in that, it would be great to share that information. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Angela.
And I just wanted to put that up there to show the benefit of the seed funding as well, that it can lead to further things like this.
Yeah, congratulations on the applied doctorate. That's fantastic news. Okay, we've got time for one or two more questions. Are there any in the room? While we're just waiting for others to think, I'm interested when you're talking about transport, Angela. Are you mainly thinking of sort of everyday commuting and getting to the shops and that sort of thing, or are you including like flights to Auckland to see your family, that sort of thing as well? So is it kind of a more extensive interpretation of transport, or is it more kind of localized transport every day?
I think what comes up in the discussions is everyday transport, and that's the challenges that people face. I think flying does need more attention, but the reality is that that's already quite socially patterned anyway. So, but yes, they're not being able to do it because of costs and because of would be included. It's just not what people generally seem to pay attention to.